Calden Vajor slipped quietly into his father's office. No one noticed him leave the party. The aristocrats and donors, the politicians of the city, they were too busy to see him dipping away between the inflated dresses and bejeweled gowns. He rushed through the vacant halls and corridors, moving like an ethereal light. Calden paused briefly at the keypad, typing in the code he had memorized for past visits. As he entered, he let the door close gently behind him and stood at the entrance of the room. The blankets of darkness were broken sparsely by patches of the city's light, sparkles of life glittering in from the window at the far wall. From where he stood, he could see the towers outside in the distance. Swarms of secret drones weaved and danced, their motions fluid in response to the shifting wind. As he stared, the sprawling city stared back at him, all at once beautiful and terrifying, the magnificence of it shrouding something darker. The grand promises of Temerden had long betrayed those with any sense. Calden was young, but he had given up on the dreams of a utopia metropolis. Temerden was nothing more than a veil, one that he was determined to get behind. His story was simple enough. The great city of Temerden had declared the first utopia metropolis in the world of Yllisius, years 1278. Of course, those familiar with its inner workings knew the truth. Temerden was far from the perfect city. Its technology far surpassed all others of the world, but it knew little of the affairs of humans. It thought itself the child of Mars, a prophecy that the world's ancestors would one day descend from the outer reaches of space to bring them home. But it came at a steep cost. The payment was the very heart of the city, and the rights of its citizens would become forfeit for its ultimate cause. Calden turned away from the lights. The world he knew was on fire, ablaze in war and strife. Mars, if there was such a thing, would not applaud them. They would not come bearing gift baskets and confetti. No, if they were to descend, there wouldn't be peace, and the world of Yllisius would never see them coming. As he moved behind his father's desk, he opened the laptop swiftly, casting away the hope that had once compelled him. Hope wouldn't bring him the answers he needed, not this time. Now he was there for truth. He was there to understand why the great city of Temerden was not so great anymore. It was the early morning of June 6, 1273, and Marvyn Kipper awoke to the smell of smoke. Throwing off his covers, Marvyn cursed. Adrenaline surged through him, and he dashed through his bedroom, nearly tearing the door off his hinges. He emerged on the second floor level, where the balcony surrounded the foyer, and he could already see the smoke rising in the center. Coughing, Marvyn ran to Emery's room, where the smoke was even denser. He shoved through the door and collapsed on the inside. She was there, lying face first on the floor. He called her name, but she didn't move. Pulling himself from the wreckage of broken wood from the door, he scooped up his daughter, taking her in his arms. Then, turning on his heel, his bare feet patted the wood in what might surely become a futile haste. "How did you ever manage to escape?" Dr. Morna inquired, her pen clicking annoyingly on the side of her notepad. Marvyn's eyes fell on the psychiatrist's notes, and he looked back at her. "I was prepared for something like this," Marvyn replied. It was true. Marvyn escaped this farmhouse with his daughter, but he never went back for his adopted son. He carried Emery far away, farther than he needed to, and stopped a yard out into the field. After setting her down, he turned, and the house was transformed into a ball of fire before his eyes. It lit the sky and the trees around it, billowing out to the hills beyond, and Marvyn watched as the boy he had accepted into his home burned with the wood. "I see. And why didn't you grab your son, Marvyn?" The psychiatrist interrupted softly. Marvyn shook his head. "I didn't have time. I knew where Emery was, but I had no idea where to find the boy." Dr. Morna was quiet while writing her notes, her eyes following the pen from beneath her spectacle-rimmed glasses, and Marvyn couldn't help but feel judged. He had spent the last week in the hospital since the event, the worst week of his life. It was a week of pain, coughing, lung damage from smoke inhalation, and uncertainty as to whether he would be alive by the end of it. But that pain was nothing, because it was also the week he was told that his daughter wouldn't survive. Marvyn wailed, audibly at first, despite the damage to his lungs, but that didn't last long. When his voice had given out and he could no longer make a sound, he wailed on the inside instead. When Dr. Collins entered the patient's room, he found a shell of what had previously been Marvyn Kipper. It was days until there was an interaction from him, and the attendees had all but given up hope, until one last effort. Dr. Collins told Marvyn that there was still a chance to save her, to save his daughter, that she had not been lost forever, that she still needed him. They waited for some time. It was just a twitch at first. The doctor made a comment that there was no use. Marvyn Kipper was gone, but when he started to leave the room for the last time, Marvyn moved again, straining, and eventually rose himself from his crippled state. "We just need to re-establish your mental state in order for you to regain custody, Marvyn," Dr. Morner said passively. "You mentioned something to the paramedics when they arrived, something that we found concerning. You said that he caused the fire?" Marvyn lowered his head, a sigh escaping his lips, and instinctively wanted a cigarette. Further dismay fell on him when he realized he wouldn't be smoking again for a very, very long time. He looked back at Dr. Morner. "Yes, I believe that Urik caused the fire," Marvyn returned lowly. Dr. Morner shook her head as she wrote, but she seemed satisfied to finally get the truth out of him. Marvyn knew what they would think. He wasn't daft. He had been one of the top agents at Scope, Temerden's most elite investigative organization, once upon a time. From there, he was recruited to join General Sir Ramirez's personal guard. He knew more than a lowly psychiatrist regarding the intricacies of the human mind and how to influence it. Still, he had no choice if he wanted to save Emery. "Please continue," Dr. Morner said, looking up from her bed. 2 days before the fire, there was an electrical outage. I'm pretty good with these things myself, but when I couldn't figure out what was wrong inside the grid, I had to call an electrician. They told me something that bothered me, and it cast into question my relationship with my newly adopted son." "And what did they tell you?" Marvyn shook his head again, taking a breath. "They said that someone had sabotaged the grid." "I see," Dr. Morner said with an already knowing tone. Marvyn Kipper turned his eye to her, a discerning one as he watched her write. "Listen, Urik is 9 years old. I know that there's no way a child could have even opened an electrical grid, much less rewire it to cause an outage for the entire district of Gilead." "Exactly my point. Yet since then, you were prepared for it to happen again," Dr. Morner commented, pausing her scribbling. "You thought that Urik was intentionally trying to set fire to your home." "I don't know what he was doing, but the boy is unusual. He doesn't speak to me. He never engaged with Emery. He just sat there. When he wasn't staring into space, he was staring at me, or at her. There was clearly something wrong with him. I bought a lock to protect the grid, but it didn't matter. I should have done more to prevent it. I should have done more to stop him." Marvyn lowered his head then, becoming quiet, and Dr. Morner could see that she wouldn't get much more out of him. Before ending the session, she ventured one more thought to the retired agent. "Allow me to talk to your adopted son, Mr. Kipper. In fact, we'll go one step further. We'll place him in a 48-hour observation hold. You will need to be available too during this period. Does that sound reasonable?" "What about Emery? Will you help her?" Marvyn asked anxiously. "If you agree to work with us while we figure out what to do about Urik, then we will place Emery in the program. And if I don't, then we'll have no choice but to seek to dissolve custody of both Urik and Emery. But let's not let it come to that," Dr. Morner said with a placating smile. The two stood from their seats and shook hands. Marvyn nodded his head before turning to leave, letting Dr. Morner retake her seat to finish her notes. Marvyn approached the door before stopping and turning back to Dr. Morner, a thought just on the edge of his lips. With a pensive stare, he uttered, "Be careful when you're watching him." Dr. Morner raised her head to meet his eyes. Bleakly, he added, "Urik is not what he appears."